Did that start? I'm gonna assume it did.
Welcome to the hypothetical reality.
Alright, so I might babble a lot more than I normally like to today, so when we're talking about the fallacies, definitely, raise your hand if you want to weigh in and reject or anything, especially having a good example of one of these, because a lot of these I don't necessarily have great examples for. Okay, so last class we looked at an example of a source that someone used for formal assignment 2, and we did kind of a drill critiquing that source, just doing a really good solid critique grounded in the text of the argument that that person was making. It's just like you'll want to do on formal assignment 2. And of course, keep in mind this is a critique, not in the sense of exclusively negative things about the source, but as in a really keen analysis, really tuned into the subtleties of what the argument is doing, good and bad. So today we're going to talk a little bit about fallacies, thinking a little more consciously about the kinds of things that can be wrong with an argument. Now when it comes to FA2 and how this applies to that, one thing I should be clear about is it's definitely not mandatory to mention specific fallacies in your paper. I should be really clear about that because people have gotten that misconception in the past. It's not mandatory to mention specific fallacies in your paper, but they are a really good tool to have at your disposal for doing a critique of the argument, as is one of the key ingredients to this assignment. So, how many of you have ever been in an argument or a discussion with someone who's being stupid? Okay, so most of you.
In this class, maybe. I think it may have happened.
Maybe. And that's the other good thing about this discussion, is it kind of gets us into what's actually happening. Because, attributing it to stupidity is a little bit semantically misleading. The issue with the person you're talking to probably is not just a sheer incapability of thinking logically. Chances are if you sat them down and had them do a Sudoku puzzle, they'd be fine if they knew like what the rules were and all that. Unless of course we're talking about like an infant or a senile person or someone with a certain type of disability. Thinking logically actually comes pretty naturally to people. I mean, it's the reason you can teach like the rules of logic to kindergartners and first graders. How many of you enjoy making logical arguments? Yeah. It's something the human brain is pretty good at, something a lot of people do enjoy doing for that reason. Unlike math, because a lot of people don't really like math, but a lot of people who don't like math still kind of enjoy logic, because it's something we're pretty well equipped for. So when you're talking to someone who's kind of being stupid, it's probably not just not being able to think logically on their part. Ignorance can be a factor. A person can lack knowledge on a topic, and that can be a problem for them. If you talk about healthcare, if you talk about healthcare policy with someone like me who knows nothing about it, the lack of knowledge will be pretty apparent pretty quickly. And that can be a problem, but a lot of the time people who don't know anything about a topic know that they don't know anything about a topic, so part of the reason I like to do this activity today, to have this discussion, is because a lot of the time what happens is people trick themselves or they try to trick each other. Sometimes it's a matter of bad faith. Sometimes you have someone deliberately trying to pass a bad argument off for a good one because they want to defend something that's wrong. And that'll be more applicable to some of these than others. Sometimes a person's very biased because they believe something's true. They're not as likely to detect the flaws in an argument. It's more likely to seem sound to them, even if it really isn't. Or you can just make a mistake, and if you're not particularly biased, you can just see an argument and it can look sound and you just don't notice what's wrong with it. But the nice thing about talking about fallacy is this is really kind of tuned into the different kinds of tricks that, people employ. Whether they're tricking themselves or trying to trick somebody else. So I've given everybody the handout that has kind of a very, very small sampling of the fallacies that exist, but they're ones that in my experience come up a lot, and particularly in the sources people use for this assignment. So we'll go over them a little bit. A non sequitur, pretty straightforward. It's any time your conclusion doesn't logically follow from your premises. When someone gives you a reason why their claim is true, and it doesn't follow from the reasons they give that their claim is true, that's a non sequitur. Whether they're evidence, whether the reasons are factually correct is another matter, but if it's a non sequitur, that means that even if those reasons being correct, those premises being correct, the conclusion just doesn't follow from them. And if you get into the really wonky, logic books, there's a lot of, interesting examples of these. Just for an example of something that falls under that head, what I've written on the board, the fallacy of the undistributed middle. All wasps are hymenoptera. Hornets are hymenoptera. Therefore, hornets are wasps. Obviously, hornets aren't wasps. The two premises there actually do happen to be true, I think, but it doesn't follow. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. This is a really, really big one. Raise your hand if you know what homeopathic medicine is. A couple. Can you explain what it is?
Yeah, I don't know specifically, but the general category is basically medicine that's not actually scientifically proven to actually work. It generally has to do with things like plant-based medication or kind of wonky, like put these incense in your house and you'll cure cancer, that sort of thing. Is that sort of what it is?
What you're describing is a slightly broader category.
Okay.
That sounds more like holistic medicine.
Yeah.
In general, homeopathic medicine is a specific type of holistic medicine. You have your hand up, do you know? So basically, homeopathic medicine is water. It's a type of placebo that's basically just water. The kind of pseudoscience behind it is that, going off the premise that cures certain things like, small amounts of snake venom can cure rashes. They kind of take that to the ultra extreme and claim that the more diluted something is in water, the better a remedy it is. And so you get these vials of water that are supposedly medicine because they have drop of water in a fish tank worth of some substance that's supposed to cure something. But a lot of the disturbingly large number of people are actually sold on this stuff. And they spend money on it. And a lot of the time they'll tell you they think it works. They feel better after they use it. And, there's a thing called the placebo effect, which is another thing, but there's also at a more elementary level, it's just post hoc ergo propter hoc. Just because you're feeling better after you took this water doesn't mean the water cured what's causing the pain. That's essentially what post hoc ergo propter hoc is. Because X happened after Y, Y caused X. Of course, yeah.
One good example for that I like is the chicken crowed and the sun rose, but the chicken crowing didn't cause the sun to rise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In the real world, you also hear this a lot in debates about politics and policy, because if people like a governor or a mayor or a president, they're going to try to attribute whatever happens when that person's in power to them. because it happened after they took power, when sometimes it's, the evidence of causation is sometimes a little flimsier. Yeah, Tyler?
Like Bush causing 9/11?
Yeah.
Or like Obama causing the economy to fail? Or like any of that?
Oh yeah. Definitely.
I had a friend that, sorry, no.
No, you can continue. Is it actually a good
It's
example?
not relevant
Okay.
at all.
Okay. So, I put begging the question on here, partly because, because this one has sort of a colloquial use that's a lot better known than its use in logic, and, you never want to say, that the colloquial use is wrong, because, people use this expression, they understand it to mean that, so it's, in what sense would it really be wrong then? But it is useful knowing that the distinction between the colloquial usage of begging the question, meaning to raise the question, and begging the question in logic, which is, of course, your type of logical fallacy. I think the best example of this I've ever come across is the one from logicallyfallacious.com. Paranormal activity is real because I experienced what can only be described as paranormal activity. It's assuming is true something necessary to prove the conclusion. Paranormal activity is real because I have experienced what can only be described as paranormal activity. When you've got the conclusion kind of hidden in the premises. It's a type of, the more well-known term for this kind of thing is circular reasoning. And of course, the wording is really what trips people up. On the Wikipedia page for that, there's a quote by Hugh C. Gouch. Whatever is less dense than water will float because whatever is less dense than water will float. Sounds stupid. But whatever is less dense than water will float because such objects won't sink in water, might pass. And the best real-life example I know from that is just the standard, how do you know person X is telling the truth? Because they were under oath. If the whole question is whether or not a person's being honest, then saying they were is just, it's kind of...
They were honest because they were honest.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I had a conversation with my friend's mom some years ago, actually, and she was talking about how stupid and irresponsible it is for a kid to get a tattoo. And I pointed out to her, I'm not sure what you're saying, because you seem to be saying that it'll turn off employers because it's irresponsible, but the only reason you seem to have for it being irresponsible is that it looks bad to employers, so that's kind of circular reasoning. And she said, well, the world is circular. And well, see, but that's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow that because the world is round, that circular reasoning isn't a fallacy. Thank you. So I got hasty generalization on there, which is, if you remember from last week talking about our friend Jeffrey Folks, him saying, one study on fracking wells found most of them are basically fine, therefore fracking is safe. And that's kind of the hasty generalization, the sweeping conclusion drawn from not a very big amount of data. In its most extreme forms, you'll have situations where, forget who it was, but that one rock musician that they say he smoked 2 packs a day since he was 10, drank a fifth of whiskey a day since he was 15, diet was meat and cheese and an occasional cake, and had just immaculately healthy liver. The hasty generalization is to say, therefore, what the fuck do doctors know? They're all quacks. And of course the opposite. Yeah.
Well, one way I like of phrasing that, which I think makes it very, it puts it in a really useful format, is like, if you're biased towards accepting the conclusion, then you ask if the evidence allows you to accept the conclusion, and if you're biased against accepting it, then you ask whether the evidence forces you to accept the conclusion, and neither of those are good things to be doing.
Yep.
So like, if you're asking that, then you're doing something wrong.
Exactly. Asking if it allows you is the hasty generalization. Asking if it forces you is the slothful induction. Cool. Slippery slope, of course. I've got that on here too. That's one of the ones that tends to be a little bit more ambiguous. And we talk about McKibben in a moment. That'll be one of the things we're asking about is are there slippery slopes inherent in his argument? Yeah, Tyler?
I read what it says here, and one of them would be, oh, well, you shouldn't smoke weed because that's a criminal thing, and it is a drug. Obviously, then once you do that, you're going to start doing worse drugs, and then you're eventually going to die.
Yes.
You will do cocaine.
Argue, exactly. You know, anytime you're arguing against X, not because of anything inherently wrong with X, but because X will make us more likely to do Y, and Y is bad. And the reason it's ambiguous is because there really is that, are there situations where X would make Y a lot more likely, or does the argument for doing X, could it be followed through to argue for Y? And so that's why it's an interesting one to talk about when discussing a sources. Is there a... Yeah.
Yeah, because that one, like, it can turn into a factual question really easily, which is a much better kind of question than saying, like, you know, than just saying, like, hey, this thing will eventually happen, spiral and all that stuff. Asking factual questions is much more productive. So, like, if you're asking about the probability of X given Y versus the probability of X, like, that's a thing that we can actually measure.
Oh yeah. Definitely. Yeah, Tyler?
It also seems like repetitive, like, pessimism, like, oh, I shouldn't leave my house because I might get a sunburn, and then I might get cancer, and then I might die. So then, obviously, the logical conclusion is to never leave your house, if that was a logical, like, way of thinking. That's a pretty clear example of
No,
this.
it's up to you. Do you want to get skin cancer or do you want to go outside?
Oh, well, you know.
You could just wear sunscreen, my dude, you know?
Yeah. Or just don't be in the sun for that long.
Yeah.
Just
Or
go
get a
on.
little umbrella, like a little
Hence why it's a
Victorian
logical
umbrella.
fallacy.
Run in the shade.
Yeah.
So you got wrong direction, which is if two events occur together, assuming A causes B when it could just as easily be right that B caused A with no less justification. I have appeal to consequences on here. Does anybody have a good example of this one off the top of their head? There's one that comes to my mind that's like by far the most common in my experience. Yeah.
One that is a little bit controversial, but is the only thing off the top of my head is, like, if God isn't real, then there is no morality that everybody has. So therefore, God must be real. So I've heard that a few times.
Yep.
Nickel for Santa Claus as well.
I can also go with Santa Claus.
I say another perspective on that would be, okay, even if you don't believe God is real, you don't want to go to hell, so you might as well live a good life.
Well, that's Pascal's wager, and that's a much different argument.
So you're appealing to the consequence of, do you want to go to hell?
Yeah.
There is a hell, so.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, okay, yeah. No, that does make sense. Sorry. Yeah, but that is Pascal's wager, and that is a...
I think the one that I come across a lot is about free will, because when it comes to making arguments for and against free will, it's like there is a sense that people would argue that, you know, morality, law, politics are very much grounded in the assumption that humans have free will, and that if we all came to the conclusion that we don't have free will, you pretty much have to rip all that shit down. And it may not actually be true that that's the case, but either way, it's, you know, the appeal to consequences in the sense that, strictly speaking, you know, how drastic the changes would be that we need to make if we all agree that we don't have free will have nothing to do with the question of whether or not humans have free will. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, I actually heard the exact argument in a class I had earlier today. It was like, do we have free will? I was like, oh, I don't think so. They're like, oh, well then, what are you gonna do with the murderer? Like, the exact.
It's tricky, but I mean, obviously, you know, there could still be arguments for, you know, putting people in jail to do certain things, but it's.
But they're not actually even relevant to the question. That's
True. I have guilt by association on there as well. There's also honor by association, which is a little bit lesser known. They're kind of the association fallacy. But I remember, this wasn't that long ago, I think Dennis Prager had Sam Harris on his radio show. And, you know, he kept saying, you know what you say in your book, which was very well received by Peter Singer, who believes people should be able to kill their children within the first 30 days of having who he wants to.
Guilt by association with Peter Singer? Are you serious?
Yeah.
Did he actually say that?
Peter Singer?
No, but Peter Singer. Jesus. I don't want.
I mean, my biology teacher in high school would joke that you should be able to abort a child within the first 100 months, which
Wait, what?
That's like 8 years,
well,
right?
what she actually said was effectively she calculated what it would have to be for 18 years, because then they're not adult yet, so it doesn't matter. But she was very obviously kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was entertaining though.
But, you know, someone, you know, says something, you know. Really, by that logic, if you allow, like, the guilt by association, you can invalidate, you know, anybody just by saying, you know, someone agrees with you, believes things that are horrible.
You believe in God, you know who else believed in God? This person who committed this mass murder a few centuries ago. Thus, all people who believe in God are guilty by association of being mass murderers.
Yeah.
So clearly, the Pope killed 1,000 people. Or something.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Something like that, yeah. Yeah, Tim.
Just clarifying the ad hominem like category, that's like attacking like somebody's, rather than like discrediting their argument, it's just discrediting their character and like their authority.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's ad hominem, you know, against the man. It's, yeah. So guilt by association falls under that, as does vulvarism, actually, the next one on the list. Did you want to say something about guilt and consequences before we move on?
I do not think I had anything.
Okay. So, vulvarism, you know, when someone gives an elaborate explanation of why their opponent came to their conclusion rather than an argument against them. I had a student in the past who was very biochem major, very, very big on cloning. She really, really liked cloning. She was very excited about cloning. And she told me, I think she mentioned this in one of her papers, you know, that when I argue with friends about cloning, what they tell me is that, you know, I'm in favor of cloning because my interest in, you know, scientific advancement is greater than my concern for human welfare. It's not an argument against cloning. It's but I told her, see, now you know what logical fallacy to accuse those people of. It's vulvarism, you know.
they're just gonna be like, what? Bulverism.
Vulvarism. Hopefully she remembers that term.
Oily disease.
C.S. Lewis invented it.
Wow, that makes sense.
But yeah, it's like, you know, it's like your amateur psychoanalysis of why a person comes to the conclusions that they do. It might be interesting to you, but it's not really an argument against the. Yeah, Tyler?
What if you do it based not on their like personal beliefs, but if you do it based on the actual like logic that they used? Like, it wouldn't be vulvarism if I say, oh, you came to that conclusion by making this false assumption.
Yeah, that's
That
not
wouldn't be
vulvarism.
Okay.
a good question. Loki's wager. Yeah, these last three are three that are a little lesser known, but I love all three.
That
of
one's
these, so
not really like a counter argument. That's more just we can't argue in general.
kind
It's
of.
like I'm losing, so like I'm just gonna get it out.
Does anybody know the background on this one from the Norse mythology?
Loki. Well, Loki's the god of mischief.
Yeah. Do you know the story?
I do not. I'm not familiar with Norse mythology. I know more Greek mythology.
Okay, that's fair.
Agree too.
So Loki had a bet with some dwarves, and the wager was that if he lost, they could take his head, and he lost. He told them, you're allowed to take my head, but you can't take any part of my neck. And there's no place they could cut it because they couldn't agree on a place where the neck ended and the head began. So
Yeah, Loki.
So then it got its. So it kind of has a legacy in logical fallacies when a person claims that because you can't determine exactly where you would make a distinction, or precisely how you define something, you can't really talk about it in any meaningful or useful manner. But I think our friend Jeffrey Folks kind of used that in the piece we looked at last week a little bit, the way he talks about pollution, and he puts it in quotes and kind of suggesting that it's not really useful to talk about pollution because I guess he's saying there's not really a meaningful distinction between things that are happening naturally and things that humans are causing. I think. Anyway, I thought that kind of fell under that category. No true Scotsman. Now this one's fun to say. I actually don't have an example of this one off the top of my head, but it's defending an absolutist claim by arbitrarily dismissing counterexamples by just inserting a word like pure or true. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard this a lot when trying to defend groups that you're a part of. So like one instance I've heard of this where like if you say that somebody is a socialist and they're saying that all socialists are really good people, and you say, well, okay, these Berkeley protesters that were throwing tomatoes and burning down buildings last week were socialists, and they were protesting. They were not doing that very well. And then you say, okay, well, no, true socialists.
Yeah.
They weren't true socialists because they weren't really part of the cause. Are good people. That's no true Scotsman.
Exactly. Yeah, Tyler.
I feel like that might work with like pacifist, right? Because if you're trying to say that like some pacifists started a riot, then you could say, oh well, they're not true pacifists, and I wouldn't bat an eye at that.
Yeah.
Like if it's related to what they're doing.
Yeah, but the definition of the term, or the actual definition of the group that's like agreed upon,
Yeah.
actually does exclude those people, then it makes sense.
Yeah.
Like a true member of the voluntary human extinction movement wouldn't have children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like that, yeah.
Yep. Did you look at the discussion board post on that?
Yeah.
I just saw today's discussion board post.
Okay.
There was one about you should. It was like a utilitarian view on if we want to save the planet, we should try to get enough people to believe that we shouldn't reproduce. This way, we can limit the effect that humans are having on the planet. And then Nick said that like it's important that like not everybody thinks that because then we'll actually go extinct.
Oh, that was fine.
Yeah, I like that you were basically in favor of it.
Yeah.
That really fits with my view of your personality.
Oh yeah.
Well, did you guys see my response to that?
Yeah, I like your response to
Oh
it.
no, I
Yeah.
missed it. I'll have to go back and check.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's twofold. It's like you were saying, if it's kind of people trying to defend a group that they're members of, kind of trying to arbitrarily exclude anybody that might make the group look bad, or the exact opposite, really extreme kind of absolutist, particularly a lot of like really extreme radical Christian sects will try to tell you that most kind of mainstream Baptists or Lutherans aren't really Christians, or in politics, you've got kind of, you know, the term rhino, yeah.
Is there a term for trying to include people in your group that are doing something good, that are like
Yeah,
in your
just
eyes,
thinking
like
Altruism?
yeah, like I mean because
Maybe.
because like sometimes when there's a terror attack, ISIS will take claim for it and they'll say, oh, it was associated with us, when like there's no way to like they could have possibly been involved.
Yep.
Like the recent thing in Las Vegas, they tried to claim, and then the investigators were like, no, that's just false.
Yeah, well, kind of going back to, I guess the closest thing to that comes to mind would be kind of like going back to association fallacy, the honor by association. So people will take somebody like, you know, Galileo, who was ridiculed for, you know, believing something that was actually true and, you know, visionary, and saying because, you know, I believe this thing that's dismissed widely as asinine, like, you know, that the earth is flat, you know, I'm just like, you know, Galileo. True and visionary ideas are sometimes dismissed as asinine, but asinine ideas are also sometimes dismissed as asinine, so you gotta take both possibilities into account. So I've also got, the last one I have on there is the prosecutor's fallacy. It's anytime someone makes an argument using probability, but they're using just unconditional probability, in an instance where there's conditions that, to get an accurate view of things, you actually need to take the conditions into account. So if you take the odds of the chances of a given student getting a perfect score on the SAT without cheating, you could use that alone as an argument that they probably cheated, because the probability of getting a perfect score without cheating is so low. But it's not really helpful, because that doesn't take anything about the student into account. If it's a student with an IQ of 200, and you were gonna say, okay, well, what's the probability of a kid with an IQ of 200 getting a perfect score on the SAT, the probability is probably a lot higher. But there's, yeah.
I think my favorite example of this is, of course, it has to do with AI risk, but it's where, I don't remember who it was, but they assigned they made a list of all the things that would have to happen for super intelligent AI to become, like, to actually kill everybody. And then they assigned probabilities to all of the statements, and then multiplied them all together and was like, hey, you know, this is like a less than 0.5 probability this is going to happen, so we shouldn't worry about it. But each one increases given that the other ones happened.
Yep.
So it's actually going to be a much higher probability than they calculated. You can't just multiply them like that.
Exactly. I mean, the really infamous example of this is the Sally Clark case that just happened in England just during the 90s. A woman was accused and actually, I think, put in jail for murdering 2 of her kids, and the argument that the prosecutors used was the chances of sudden infant death syndrome happening are 1 in 8,500, and so the chance of it happening twice, that's 1 in 73 million, that it was, you know, a coincidence, but obviously if it happens in a household once, there's probably something, whether it's genetic or atmospheric, that increases the probability it would happen again. You know, fortunately, the London Statistical Society took issue with the verdict and tried to, you know, get the sentence overturned and all that. Okay, so does anybody have any questions? Yeah, Jack.
I think it's interesting, maybe less so in literature, but I think 2 of the ones that we see most commonly today are guilt by association and no true Scotsman, and they work together in very interesting ways. They create this kind of dynamic of, is this person actually involved, and is it right to blame them and blame other people for it? I just think that's interesting.
Just because networks, in terms of who talks to who and who likes who, are so complex that, you know, guilt by association, you could almost implicate anybody for anything, you know.
And a lot of it's also about drawing arbitrary boundaries, where there isn't actually a true answer. It's all just wherever people want to define the boundaries. And there are some boundaries which are more useful than others, so you want to divide reality at the joints, which is call it like, you want to divide it into good pieces where the definitions actually make sense and give you valid inferences from the definition for what's actually true. But a lot of people don't want to do that, and then so they can draw inferences that they shouldn't actually be able to do.
Yup. Yeah, it's tricky. Yeah, Tyler.
I was watching a John Oliver segment on forensic evidence, and it just reminded me of that. It's pretty much the how forensic evidence has been pretty much like discredited time and time again. Like maybe if it's DNA, it's a bit better, but like people, I think maybe like 10 years ago, there was a case where wait, no, it wasn't. It was I think in Spain there was some sort of a terror attack, and they found some fingerprints that they matched to someone in Utah of America. And I know there's no Utah in Spain, I'm just like emphasizing that. So yeah, they actually wound up detaining the guy, and then luckily, before the guy was sent to Spain to be tried, they found another person who was actually in Spain at the time with the exact same fingerprints, or who would have met the scam. So that they were similar enough that a detective or a computer wouldn't have been able to tell the difference, and so that kind of threw a wrench into that.
It's interesting. I didn't know that about forensic evidence.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, also like if you're at like a crime scene, like blood can get mixed up. So then if you take a blood sample from a pool of blood, it's like that doesn't really do much. Also, you find hairs. Apparently, somebody was convicted and they were sent to. This was in America. They were sent to jail based on like a hair, matching a hair. And then when they did DNA testing 26 years later, they found that it was like a dog's hair, not the guy's hair. So they
So
let
not
the
only
guy
was
go.
he in prison for 5 years, but they also thought he was a dog.
So yeah, they kept this guy in prison for like 26 years, and then they realized that it couldn't have been, or that the evidence that was against him was complete bullshit. So the guy was like in an interview was joking, yeah, I guess they dog killed the guy, or something like that. I feel like I wouldn't have been that relaxed if I had just been in jail for like 26 years, but you know.
Maybe he was really happy he was gonna get out.
Now he's about to sue the city. Like, he's definitely happy.
So that's why this stuff is so important, it's like being able to think clearly about whether or not someone did something in that like judicial situation, But yeah, it's weird when it comes to like the criminal justice stuff. A couple of years ago I was looking at just like I think the Wikipedia page for like pseudosciences just to kind of I guess I was looking for like discussion board ideas, and I think one of the things on there was lie detectors, because apparently that's like a really
Oh yeah,
Oh, yeah.
there's
sketchy.
like even the person who invented it actually has stated several times that it is not to be credited at all. Like you can put a cucumber attached to one, and it'll be like, oh, well, the cucumber's lying. What does that even mean? It's not alive.
Those aren't allowed in legal circumstances.
Not anymore. Not anymore, but they still exist,
Well, yeah, like you can voluntarily submit to one.
which is nonsense.
Yeah.
Well, have we talked about like the guy that made like Loose Change? Loose Change is that like the original like documentary that tried to claim that 9/11 was an inside job. So he actually mentions in like the History Channel piece on that like when he first came up with the idea it was a work of fiction. But here's what's so amusing though, when him and his friend debated the editors of Popular Mechanics, because the Popular Mechanics had run a piece pretty much refuting their whole theory. Him and his friend debated the two editors of Popular Mechanics, and the guy that actually made the documentary who conceived of the idea, who'd begun with the ideas of work of fiction, was, if you watch him during that debate, he's pretty chill. His friend is the one who's really, really worked up. He's really mad at these Popular Mechanics guys. It's like he's really sold on this shit. I don't know about the guy who made the original film. he got one really loyal follower. So yeah, hopefully you find these useful. Hopefully you'll keep them in mind when looking at when starting FA2. Like I said, they're not mandatory, but it's a good set of tools to be able to use. Did people bring the? I mentioned last class and in that Blackboard announcement to bring your argument informal today. So take those after you out them. I'm thinking at least half the people having them. Does that sound like was that a good bet? Yeah.
So let's do paragraphs.
Huh?
So let's do paragraphs, right?
It may or may not have been 2 paragraphs.
So you do an argument and then you oppose it.
Oh yeah. So, as sort of a drill to kind of practice this, I want you to. So now you're looking at an argument you wrote that you don't agree with. The best argument you could make for a conclusion that you believe is wrong. So I want everybody to take a moment to read what they wrote and write a sentence or two. What is wrong with this argument? And if you can name specific fallacies in doing so, that's even better. But if you can't, at least state what you find wrong with the argument here, as clearly as you can.
I have it.
And if you don't have your version of this, just kind of go on with the person next to you. Yeah. Kind of an odd case because both of these things are actually very good. So you're just kind of emphasizing different
You're reading
aspects
your.
of it.
I just.
Right.
It's like an example of an argument where two people are kind of.
See, the problem is we weren't trying to strum
This
it
would have
in. We were
been
trying to
possible
like
to determine how much longer it was.
Yeah. So that's good though, that's what makes this kind of
There
chill.
was no guarantee that it would have ended.
If you didn't convince yourself of it, then there's.
Yeah.
right.
Really?
That is something that's outside of our universe.
Yeah.
So it's true meta for us.
Yeah, it's the meta for us.
Finding anything good?
I saw him 3 times yesterday.
Like, there's no way to argue for it.
His POA on
Arguing
the,
for it is, we have to just show that we can make simulations. That we then have to create simulations inside. And then.
No, it's just like I said, like not just emphasizing different things.
That's what Paul said. There's the probability of being a real person.
Like franchising or not.
In a universe,
So like what support system is better? Like for baseball system where they have like
that's
RTs.
just short.
Or like for like British
This
soccer
might be
system,
begging
like
the
lower
question.
leagues. And if you like
Still, I
lower
mean,
league,
it's
you
still,
like which system is better?
Granted, you can let
I feel like those systems have pros and cons. Just in this one, I emphasize the pros.
Wait, which way?
Franchising.
because
It does have the pros I'm sure. Like, there's also pros. It's not like a full schedule.
we are the first one.
I mean, it's one of the first
Because we're controlling it now.
To create higher universe.
It's more just
Yeah.
having a
I know, so-
I feel like this is just kind of
identify the
Like, I don't know.
It's just a claim that you don't really provide reasons.
Yeah.
Like maybe there's something more specific and it's not taking into account what this is in terms, but it's
I guess this is not.
But it could be allowed.
it's not
So without
motion,
guarantee that
it's
person will
it's statements.
So
It's
the only way
wrong.
to do that would be if we are citizens.
I mean,
I like it a lot.
I would say that like the statements are true, but they like add up to like
So.
an unnecessary exclusion.
Pretty much.
Right.
Just a fun thing.
Right, because
I was gonna bring that, I was
I mean,
gonna bring that up for guilty by association.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, because I guess this could be like reduced to pretty like simple like that. So.
Finding anything good?
Yeah.
Pre-planned.
I kind of like just assumed that people were
I mean,
Yeah, since
maybe there's some
chemical because they didn't have
there's
they
not
went
definitive
different organizations, so it's like some sort of
there would be ways to move towards a more environmental.
Yeah, it's kind of.
Yeah, they don't go without.
So what sense is this a good reason?
I mean, it's not really security, it's just like assuming that people
It's either this or this. You have to choose like the lesser.
It may not quite necessarily, it's just like really
Yeah.
presented as
And maybe I think that
that.
it's not taking into account, you know, there could be alternative solutions to make it clear.
Yeah, it doesn't like identify like individuals.
Did anybody find anything interesting? Yeah.
Is there like a sort of fallacy where you said like it's either this or there's that and there's no other options?
False psychology.
It doesn't like yeah.
I have that too.
You have a false psychology.
Maybe. I don't know.
Because I don't
I don't know if it's possible. There is. It would have been impossible to determine how long the premise is going. It was impossible to determine how long.
But then if you know,
Even if you know she was like you could have.
I feel like
Right.
So yeah, if you're implying that like either we did X or Y would happen, and there's another possibility there. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if it's called.
My argument in the paper, obviously,
Did you find anything good?
no. You were simply dooming them to eventually come to the same destination as you, and then just A on that. Exactly. And then the rest of their life. So it's better to just get that out of the way as soon as possible.
If it's just said to say, oh, what do you think? Why don't you treat this?
This is clearly not like it's
I'm not interested that you would not have.
But I'll bring
Yeah, no, I think the head is really fun for you. I think it starts to break down a little bit in sort of the tail end. It's sort of, yeah, the weird way it started is and also the
Here's the interesting thing. I know what it is, but I'll learn perspective, they would have to average be significant.
I actually voiced that I
Well, the problem is,
also there's a lot of flags.
might still be safer than the self-driving car, even if it's self-driving car.
You should just get two.
So that means it's deal.
Get two and put them together.
It's not so much what you make it this is
Okay, let's regroup.
That's where the original was.
Did anybody else find anything interesting they wanted to share before we move on to McKibben? Yeah,
Oh,
Tyler.
wait, no, definitely.
Okay. Anybody? Okay, so this is cool because we, going into McKibben's argument, I think a lot of these questions are applicable when it comes to, you look excited.
Yeah.
So basically, I think the core of his argument is that once we allow there's a clear, easy distinction between somatic gene therapy and germline genetic engineering, but once we allow germline genetic engineering, we've taken a leap far beyond we were ever gone before, and there's the question, is that a slippery slope, or is he right? Once you've done any type of this, is it really impossible to go back? Is the line between fixing problems and enhancing offspring really meaningless? But I was also thinking a lot about what Minsky said in the reading last week. Let's see if I have it here. No, I have it. But could such beings really exist? This is Minsky. Many thinkers firmly maintain that machines will never have thoughts like ours, because no matter how we build them, they'll always lack some vital ingredient. They call this essence by various names, like sentience, I pronounced that wrong, but consciousness, spirit, or soul. Philosophers write entire books to prove that because of this deficiency, machines can never feel or understand the sorts of things that people do. However, every proof in each of these books is flawed by assuming, in one way or another, the thing that it purports to prove, the existence of some magical spark that has no detectable properties. The question is, when McKibben talks about meaning at the beginning of the passage he wrote and the end, is he committing this fallacy that Minsky is accusing those kind of people of this meaning is this arbitrary thing that he's beginning by assuming and arguing that it's... Yeah, Jeremy?
Okay, so this is definitely the thing I've most disagreed with in this class so far.
Okay.
I could write an essay on how much I disagree with this paper, but with this chapter. But
Okay.
so just responding to what's up there. So first of all, yeah, a lot of it I think was definitely a slippery slope fallacy, because he's just saying that, like, okay, you know, where does it end? Like, we'll start like creating these weird, like, are these even human anymore? Which is sort of an arbitrary distinction anyway, in my opinion. And like the whole meaningless thing. But I think his probably his worst argument specifically, like, I have a lot of problems with his writing style, his argument style also.
Okay.
But his actual worst argument, I think, is the whole meaning thing, because that is completely arbitrary. Meaning is like, I mean, assuming that you're coming from the same sort of standpoint that I do of absurdism, which is like, I don't think that anything actually has meaning. It's just we have to give it meaning to, like, you know, to actually do things. Like, we assign arbitrary utilities to various world states and things like that. So he's just then saying that, okay, because my arbitrary utility function says that this doesn't have meaning, then therefore it doesn't have meaning. Like, without any sort of option of like, hey, maybe we can redefine the utility function, or like, why does it even matter, or like, does anybody else actually care about this? He also like doesn't actually consider really the other side of the argument at all. It's almost entirely negatives that he just sort of asserts and like cites people and things like that. He doesn't really consider all that much like the benefits of what this could bring to the world.
Okay.
So like, there's a lot of people that say things like, you know, this could really, really improve genetic disease. Like, I mean, he does talk about genetic disease and stuff like that, but he doesn't really get into like how much this could improve the world in general, with like how many people this could help, or like why maybe improving the entire human race could be a good thing, or like maybe even improving a subset of the human race, which could then like maybe have better morality and more intelligence, could then help improve everybody else. Like, he just doesn't consider any of that at all and just asserts his negative opinion. I'm gonna stop there because I feel like I could keep going on about this, but yeah.
Okay, I should start with someone who... Does anybody want to push back against that? Because I should probably start with... Yeah, Mateo.
Yeah, okay, so wait, what was, okay, sorry, remember, what was the last point you just made?
The last point was that I think that there could be benefits to improving just a subset of the human race, because,
Okay. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I remember him saying something along the lines of like, maybe like, you know, like a potential benefit of introducing this like technology or whatever would create, or like, the problems that we're going to experience in the coming years are going to be like far greater than anything we're like we're used to dealing with. He hypothesized. So he like brought up the possibility that having somebody with higher intelligence would be able to just like solve those problems. So like I mean that is addressing like a benefit.
Okay, maybe I just forgot about it then, but that's honestly something that could happen. So,
Well, he quotes, Koshland talking about, that the risks of germline genetic engineering are great, but the rewards are likely to be greater. So there's also the question of what the rewards would have to be greater.
yeah, so like he does these quotes and he deals with them in like short bursts.
Yeah.
But it's very much not a cost-benefit analysis kind of thing, but he presents it as if he's done a cost-benefit analysis. And that's what really bugs me about it.
I mean, this is just the first chapter. We don't know where it went from there.
I mean, yeah, I guess.
further.
Well, and the thing is, it is kind of tricky on his part because he knows a little more about the risks than the rewards, because there is kind of that issue of we've experimented on animals and the results have been absolutely horrendous, and when will there be a point we can experiment on a human without something like this happening? Whereas the rewards, it's hard to know what they would or wouldn't be at this point. But Tyler, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I disagree with his whole, these are problems we've never dealt with before. I would say that every new thing would be just as problematic as any other new thing. We're just progressing and dealing with more complicated things because we're getting farther and farther from like where we originally started. But what I would like to point out though is germline editing, engineering, sorry. Effectively like changing the genes of plants and animals and whatever. We've already effectively been doing that in a much less direct way for thousands of years by selectively breeding plants. So I see no difference between that and this. This is just much more direct and doesn't give as much time to weed out possible bad things. For example, like watermelons apparently used to be like this big and had like no fruit. And now they're this big and have like entirely full of like their fruit. Yeah, exactly. So like also like bananas. I mean actually bananas are genetically engineered. But
Of course that's a lot of like selective breeding though, right?
yeah, so I'm just saying like selective breeding we've already been doing for thousands of years and just through domesticating plants and animals, and so I would argue that if we're worried about a slippery slope, we're already on it.
Whether selective breeding is a slippery slope toward germline genetic engineering.
I'm saying if there's going to be problems based on the germline engineering, we're already on a path toward it, whether we start doing that or not.
I mean,
We're already effectively doing the exact same thing.
I mean, you can do like damage with selective breeding, but Webster, you got that for a while.
Well, I guess to address that, I feel like he is kind of drawing the line between like saying like, yes, this like we have. When he's talking about the athletes, right? He's like, sure, you could have two athletic parents marry and their children or their child will have more athletic genes, and that is like a kind of selective breeding if they want to like produce an athlete, or they could like mess with their genetics. But he like apparently says like that is where I'm drawing the line. Like I'm saying, like I'm here and I'm saying this is where we should stop. As for his slippery slope, in general, I kind of like. I find myself making slippery slope arguments fairly often, and I find that like it is a fallacy, but in so many cases it seems to me that like it's also true. And in this case, I actually do agree with him that like it is a slippery slope. So I think in my mind, there's like a couple premises. Like one, like it is slippery slope, so like this will lead to this, and then two, that like so like X leads to Y and Y is bad, and then he has like some other like arguments built in like that are like. Secondary, which would be like inequality derived from like starting or like experimenting would be bad. And so like I agree with that like X would lead to Y. I don't agree that Y is bad.
Okay.
But like and also for the feelings thing, I think he's like saying like this is how I derive meaning from the world, and he's appealing to other people who derive meaning in a similar way. He's saying if you derive meaning in a similar way, then you should oppose this, because if this happens, then the meaning for us is going to be taken out of the world. And if we are like a large majority of the population, then we should know what's happening, because like we lose our meaning.
Elmer?
I forgot what I was going to say.
Because when I was talking about germline engineering being similar to selective breeding.
I had something to say about that. I can't remember what it was. I think I was gonna say something about how bananas are all the same.
Yeah, bananas are
Yeah.
all
So if humans are selectively engineered in such a way, I mean, you were talking about how there could be potential problems to that, but there could be problems just like disease wiping out a whole group of humans.
Oh, I mean, yeah, like, sorry, can I
Did you talk about this?
can I have a
Yeah.
success line? Yeah, so I'm pretty sure I spoke about that like last week, and how like we could just be very careful to not do that for
We did talk
our
about it
immune
last week.
systems. But something that fun fact that I just want to share, the reason why banana candy doesn't taste like actual bananas is because the type of bananas that the flavor is based off of have gone extinct because of a major plague on bananas.
Really?
So we actually don't grow that type of banana anymore, but it does taste like bananas, just not the ones we've eaten.
Yeah, if you've ever taken like actual bananas and just put them in a dehydrator to make dried bananas, they definitely don't taste like what you get from like the bulk section at the grocery store.
That's so interesting.
Nick, did you wanna?
I feel like my point was already made.
Okay, Daniel.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to address a little bit of the argument that he does in regards to the feelings. He talks about how, well, if people are engineered in such a way that they have like a lower threshold for happiness, so they are happy more often, and he's just like, well, that would be just meaningless and stuff like that because it's their brain that we're modified with. But the thing is, like already people have like a their brains and how they feel and the emotions that people have end up being just a product of the chemicals that are in their brain. Those that they have a chemical imbalance, it's not necessarily that they, as a person, as like the conscious person, they are sad. It's really more that the chemical imbalance in their brain is causing that, and the same thing with the emotions. It's not necessarily that you are happy. It's more like, oh yeah, your brain is releasing certain chemicals, and you feel happy.
So your brain's not like. I'm kind of confused the distinction between you're making between like you and your.
Yeah, I'm just like basically saying that he's like drawing a line where there isn't really that much of a line to be drawn.
Okay.
Simply just because it's like the same thing. It's just like altering it very minute thing.
Yeah. Can I try to explain it?
Yeah.
Also, so I think what you're saying is that from a reductionist standpoint, everything that goes on in your brain is your brain and mind are the same thing. So anything that goes on your mind is a product of your brain. So the fact that it's modified to be slightly more happy or slightly more intelligent or whatever, rather than random, is totally arbitrary.
Exactly.
And yeah, which I agree. Yeah.
Interesting point that brings up is, so say you have a person who is experiencing like depression or some form of psychosis, and then you were to give them some sort of antidepressant or antipsychotic, would you say that would you or any of you say that is fundamentally changing the person, or would you say that it is helping them deal with a problem that they can't help?
What was your first option?
What?
Changing the person.
Are you changing the person on a fundamental level and they're no longer themselves effectively?
Giving them a drug? Or
Yeah.
giving them like a psychoactive drug?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think you're changing them fundamentally as a person because the effects of the drug are probably going to wear off.
I mean, like, let's say somebody's like depressed and you give them antidepressants, and then they're never going to go off of that until they feel like they're no longer have depression or whatever. Would you say that that is fundamentally altering them, or would you say that it is just helping them to experience more happiness?
Well, I don't think, okay, so as somebody who knows people who are on antidepressants, I don't think it's fundamentally changing them as people. I think it's just helping them deal with like, it's like making them, it's allowing them to live basically.
So then would you say that decreasing the threshold for human happiness would be in any way changing humanity, or would it just be allowing them to be a bit happier?
I think it's improving humanity by allowing people to be happier.
So that's my question for like McKibben or somebody who believes with him.
That's true.
Webster?
For your like question, I would say why not both? And fundamentally changing a person isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, people fundamentally change all the time.
That's
through,
true.
like, different experiences. I would say both of that. And also, I feel like that like we're already like we already have these things in our brain that and we don't really like totally control it. So like having genetics it doesn't change anything. That seems like a Loki's wager kind of fallacy to me. That's like, oh, we don't really have free will, so like slavery isn't bad. I mean, I know that's like really extreme, but like, I don't know if I agree with the argument that like that type of process already exists. So like I personally would be against like genetically altering people so they were happy all the time.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be against genetic altering in general, but I would be against that specific type, even though like there are things that kind of already do that. You can draw a line, like they are fundamentally different.
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think that it's necessarily a good thing to make everyone happy all the time. I think that slightly decreasing the threshold might be beneficial, but I don't know if I would like, because that kind of leads to sort of the dystopian sort of, oh, there's a we're being controlled by a tyrannical government, but they're making us happy all the time.
Like, you guys ever read that?
I was just gonna say
Because the whole time I was
Yeah.
reading this article, like reminded me of.
Yeah, so who really cares? We're all happy all the time, so
Yeah.
whatever. Like, so something like that I'm not in favor of, but I think, again, it's all about like how it's used, right? Like, if
Yeah.
you're curing diseases, that's great. If you're trying to make sure that nobody ever opposes your tyrannical rule, that's obviously,
Yeah, yeah.
What would you say about like altering somebody's like genome so that they're less aggressive or less prone to commit like criminal activity?
Personally, or?
Yeah. Or
Okay,
just,
so
like,
I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. I think that, I'm not even sure how I feel about this psychoactive drugs thing. I just want to know other people's views. I don't know, like if a person was able to, see, my whole thing is I think that it's okay for psychoactive drugs to be used if a person's willing, right? But then you're effectively implementing something similar to that before they're even born. So I feel like taking the choice away from someone, but then again that also conflicts with my view that they're not a person until they are born. So I'm not sure where I stand on that.
Yeah, because then they would be like
Yeah, like
that
they don't
person.
have any rights until they're born, effectively. But I think that they should have control over themselves as a person. So I'm not sure how I feel about this topic in general. I need more time to think
Oh
about it.
yeah, I will just like on that like by that reasoning like a person and like anybody who's born like doesn't really have control over their life because they don't have control over like their
Yeah, but
genes
that's why I'm
to
not
begin with.
so
Yeah.
sure about that.
But I think the distinction he's making is that you can kind of, it's sort of twofold. You can make them extremely unique in one way by enhancing something to make them especially adept at something and raising this expectation because this is what their parents desire. Or the other thing he's worried about is if it becomes common, to enhance offspring in certain ways, intellectually, athletically, that if there's parents who make a decision not to judge their child and that's a decision they've actually made that's given them like disadvantages.
I think I think where I stand is changing a personality feature of theirs. I think I would be against, but something like say we know the person's going to be born really really frail, and there's a chance they'll die. I think that increasing their bone mass or something like that would be more okay than effectively like directly altering their personality. Because although personality, I'm very convinced is at least like partially due to your environment when you're brought up, and that your genetics don't play, like they probably like say like this is the range of personalities that you have from your genetics. Eventually you'll like slim down due to your environment. That's how I think of it. But I feel like doing that ahead of time takes a certain amount of yeah, I mean not necessarily potential, but potential.
It's hard to predict like what would happen.
Exactly, like I don't see how you're gonna directly know that somebody's gonna be aggressive. So I think that I don't know, I think that assuming we have free will, I think that'd be taking away some of their free will, which I'm not sure is your right to do. But then again, what are rights and free will anyway?
I actually wanted to ask you something, but you can weigh in first.
Yeah, so with that question, I think that first of all, personally, I'd be in favor of changing certain personality traits to within certain bounds. So like if you have somebody that is would originally be very aggressive, like criminally aggressive, I think that would be fine to bring it down to like maybe the maximum of within allowable bounds, or maybe even like required to do that, because they could be a danger to the rest of society. Maybe with a random factor in there, so like, you know, a variation around that or something like that. But I think that that's fine because after they're born, it's not like they can tell the difference. Like, we're perfectly fine with allowing random variation within those bounds normally in just sort of how we normally have children. So like, after they're born, that makes no difference to them whether they've been genetically engineered or not with their personalities. That's still their personality, and they wouldn't give it up for, at the time, how their original personality would have been if they were not genetically engineered. So I don't see a real difference between those two things. The other thing is that on the whole nature versus nurture thing, I know IQ and like later on, IQ is about 60% or so determined by genomes. If I'm remember correctly, something like 60%. So if personality is anything like that, then it could have a significant effect on later effects, but not all of the effects. So again, like the you know, having the right teachers, having the right parents, and that sort of thing is important, but being able to modify the genome is also really important, and that could have significant benefits on people that are able to do that.
And like I've heard a statistic like the exact opposite for personality. It's like 40% genetics and like.
Okay, yeah, it might it's
Okay,
I bet it's
one
about
of
40%. Yeah.
How would an experiment even be run to quantify that?
You can do things like twin experiments.
Yeah,
Those are
fraternal and identical.
really often how you figure out everything, because twin experiments are great.
My twin and I are very different people.
So is the idea that like if we kind of regulate this, so you curtail specific types of personality traits like extreme like disposition to aggressiveness or extreme kind of predisposition to like shyness that would make somebody like way too nervous to interact. If you only take kind of those things that are extremely problematic and within the sphere that remains like
and I mean, to be honest, if you're looking at certain kinds of disabilities like autism or like whatever the technical name is for being really angry disorder, like it's really more of a continuum that we just draw a shelling point on. So like we're okay with reducing those when it's a disability, but like when it's not a disability, it's still a continuous thing. So like I don't really see any difference from like curtailing it to this amount. And I think it would be a good idea to make it sort of a random process. So like maybe in 1 out of 10 cases, we don't actually do that. We don't actually change the personality at all to keep genetic variation and keep like the species variation alive. Could be an interesting idea. I don't know if that would work or not because I just thought of it, but
yeah.
Isn't it already?
Well, in terms of that, like once people start genetically modifying themselves, they're going to want to keep going because humans are greedy. So.
Slippery slope.
Oh,
yeah, Jackie fun.
oh.
We're almost out of time.
Well, so that was actually one of my questions is that like people are going to want to keep. There's a real question about where you would draw the line sometimes, because is the idea that the laws would be strict so that if the person's IQ was like below 100, you could like bring it up, but you couldn't raise the person above 100. But I mean, the problem is that if 100 is already kind of like it's an average, so if everybody raised to that about 100, you would just be higher. Yeah,
It kind of reminds me of like a Kurt Vonnegut's story. I don't remember which one it is. The one where the guy, everybody is equally disabled.
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
virtually.
I know that one.
Oh, what's the name?
Harrison Bergeron.
Harrison Bergeron.
that,
It reminds me of that story. Pretty much everybody in that story, if you're too smart, they put earbuds in you and they send out a random noise every so often, and the volume is dependent on how smart you are. If you're really strong, they put weights on you. If you're really pretty, you have to wear an ugly mask. It's very interesting, like the concept. I don't know how much I like the actual story, but it's by Kurt Vonnegut, which I think we're going to be reading later, maybe.
Thursday.
Thursday. Oh, okay. Well, very topical.
Is that
It kind of reminds me of that story because if you're trying to cap how amazing people can be, that's also kind of what they're doing.
Well, it's the opposite.
It's pretty much
how
the
not
same,
amazing.
though.
So like if you were weak,
No, it's the same thing because we're not saying we're improving people. We're effectively, like you were asking, can we raise people above a certain threshold?
Yeah.
And that's effectively what the Harrison Bergeron Society is preventing. they're actively preventing people from being too high above the average. In fact, they want everybody to be
By
average.
lowering the average.
Yeah.
Just like
Instead of
But
by
this is renting it by raising.
No, it wouldn't be. If you say that you can't put someone's intelligence above a predetermined threshold, that's the same thing as limiting everyone's intelligence.
But it's not saying that people who are naturally
Oh, of
above
course,
that.
you're not purposefully impairing people who are already have an advantage.
Right.
It's just a different way of accomplishing the same goal.
Yeah.
But it's much better
Read the story.
way.
Is it though?
Thanks
I mean,
for,
yeah, it is.
thanks for coming in.
In my opinion.
Are we handing this
Discussion.
or are we?
No.
Yeah.
I do.